Hello, I'm Dr. Alan Malik, and welcome to this third webinar in our series on leveraging pediatric screening. In the previous webinars, we've basically been following C.J. Peek's three-world view. In the first webinar, we basically got into all the clinical side of the whole process. And then in the second webinar, we got into the operational sort of things. And basically the first view, what we're really looking at was, you need to go broader, you need to go with more depth, and you need to get dynamic about how you question so you can actually get more information out of the interview, and you think of the whole process as an interview. In the second webinar, it was really more about how do we automate, how do we use our patients as our input, and that whole process of essentially getting to the point where you can actually remove staff completely from the process if you basically go from your EMR out, get it done on a link via text or email, and then have it come routing directly back into your EMR. You can get all that screening done before they even show up for their visit, and that's the ideal situation. So in this webinar, we're just going to get into how do we make that business case, and so it's look at this financial aspects of this whole thing, and in this particular environment, it's really pretty easy to put that kind of picture together. So let's get into it a little bit. So here we are looking at how do we make that business case. And so what you're really doing here is you're automating process. I mean, that's the big thing that's happening here. And you want to kind of make your comparisons to if you're doing this on paper or you weren't getting reimbursement or able to get reimbursement. I mean, things of that nature. The big thing we need to look at are things like, how much more time are you creating for yourself? How much more time are you creating for your staff to support your processes? Which then the automation kind of takes that away, so that becomes a big savings in cost. And then you want to think about your just basic operational sort of costs and so forth. Just the very cost of paper itself, actually, it turns out to be expensive relative to electronic. And then obviously you've been working on how to get reimbursement in your pediatric clinics and so forth, but there's always reimbursement available. If you start putting it all together and look at the whole picture, you can show that positive ROI. So we'll run through all that here real quick. The first thing you need to look at here is, are you meeting requirements? And, what does that cost to meet those requirements, and how important is it to meet those requirements? So there's, all these AAP guidelines and all these sorts of things that you really should be doing this. And then even from a marketing perspective, you want to be doing this type of screening because you're able to show then that you're doing a better quality of care, you're doing a better level of management of the children and the parents and so forth. So, but there's other factors in here you can also start to look at. There's requirements from a population management perspective. Maybe you're in a capitated environment, so you have to meet certain criteria there. In some instances, they're paid for performance. Just looking back at your basic, what is it costing you to meet your quality and safety and risk sort of issues? What are the advantages of using an automation electronic to get by those sorts of issues? And then I guess the last area you can think about is, grants and studies and so forth. And so using data to help get those sort of things funded helps you along. And then another concept we want to probably get into is the idea of expanding your service lines. I mean, we did a case study in the first webinar where we started talking about how they basically co-located a behavioral health therapist inside of a pediatric clinic. And basically the behavioral health therapist was an independent business entity essentially, and they were able to pay for themselves, and then the screening paid for itself, and then you ended up with a much better service between the two of them. You could do handoffs between the two and so forth. So all different ideas on how to get things funded, but it's pretty easy to justify good in-depth screening and getting into the information where you need to. So let's think about, reducing operational costs. Where we get into that is we start thinking about, the cost of paper. I mean, there's a hard cost for paper. There's a cost for printing. And then you got to think about all the labor associated with accessing, distributing, scoring, all that kind of stuff. So there's a bunch of cost associated with using paper. And everybody thinks, paper's free. Well, no, paper isn't free. And if you think about the admin cost per electronic relative to the actual cost of paper, you'll find it's actually cheaper to go electronic. And that's before you even get to all the other labor savings sort of things it's done for you. Automation, obviously, then the big thing you're going after is the labor side of this thing. Once again, it's instead of having to do data entry through your staff, have your clients do your data entry and let your computing automatically score things and do all that work as well. The other thing we really find an awful lot of, believe it or not, is error. There's a ton of scoring error. There's even getting people in the right age group and so forth. You end up messing up a lot. I mean, there was some of the initial studies that we're doing when we did the Foundations for Success. They went in afterwards and kind of looked at. They were seeing 30% of the time someone was either screwing up a calculation or they were messing up which age group to put somebody in. And so, you got error creeping in there just from using, human labor. I mean, that whole side of things. You also need to think about automatically pulling together the right protocol of screenings and so forth, especially as you're moving across different age groups and so forth, which one to give where. The amount of time and energy you have to spend on managing that side of things about what you should be doing or shouldn't be doing. In that process, I mean, it's minor, it's less than a minute sort of thing, but it's another labor cost that you get rid of when you do things electronically and using the automation that's here. So, the big thing here is you're going to eliminate the paper cost and you're going to enable automation. Ideally, if you did a full going from the EMR out, getting it done at home, back into the EMR without staff even being involved, essentially driven that cost to zero. There's a lot of advantages to going electronic in this whole process. So then we look at reimbursement, and you should be aware of most of these already, but typically people are using that 96-110. And an interesting story behind that one is that it was actually a child psychologist that first pulled this one together. And he was up in Minnesota. He was working for it was actually even part of that original Foundations for Success group. And he just kind of said, he just went to Blue Cross Blue Shield and said, I need a CPT code. And for doing the ASQSE. And he was routing people into his child psychology department relative to primary care. And he just said, give me a CPT code. And they gave him that one, and it stuck. I mean, it's basically out there on a national level at this point. So it's kind of interesting how that goes. So, the other things you got to be careful about are obviously proper documentation, which is one of the great things about doing an automated report and so forth. It pulls a lot together for you. You have a complete audit trail in terms of what's going on. The other aspect of reimbursement that you need to think about is that it gives medical a leg up relative to all the other ways that data could get entered, and we could actually do detection on especially the 0 to 3 portion of the population. You're ideally set up in a medical clinic to be the person who does that. And so, you got people coming to you all the time, and you can basically, at every single well child visit, you could be asking information and pulling stuff in and making money off of it. I mean, most programs are, essentially have the positive ROI and they're making money. So hopefully it all works for you. So, just a quick demonstration of positive ROI here. We go through and we sit back and go, all right, what are our real costs here, Basically using electronic over paper, we may be saving as much as 50 cents per administration. And then you start thinking about automation over manual processing, just a small amount of time it takes to do the calculations, to distribute and pull back and all that kind of stuff. So maybe another 50 cents. So, you get up around $1. Now we turn around and say, okay, well, what does it cost to have, service fees done in terms of electronic and so forth? And that processing is usually always under less than 50 cents per. So let's net out at 50 cents. Then you got to consider the license fees. So, the only ones you really have to worry about that on are the ASQ and the ASQSE, which is kind of core to this. But as you get into any of the other pediatric screenings, they're usually public domain. I think the only other exception is the MCHAT, and I think Dr. Robbins charges like $100 per physical site per year, so it's not that big a deal. And then you look at, even your worst reimbursement cases, most of our Medicaid that we've ever seen can get at least $7 per administration. So you're going to net out, $7.50 less whatever you're going to do on the license fees, if they are applicable or not. Let's sit back and think about startup costs, maybe, $7,500 for startup costs, and you sit back and go, all right, within 1,000 administrations, I've already covered the cost of my, all my startup fees and so forth, getting my EMR interface done, et cetera, et cetera. So when you flush the whole thing out, within 1,000 administrations, you're basically positive on your ROI. And that's easy enough to do. I mean, doctors' panels are at least 2,000 to 4,000 kids per pediatrician sort of thing. So, it doesn't take long to pull all that back together. Yeah, let's go back and look at the community mental health center sort of concept. So these folks were doing actually, getting more details here. They were doing around 7,000 administrations per year. They started out as just tablet launch, so implementing with hard copy reports. They weren't even routing them in and out of their EMR. They basically at that point expanded out to using a front desk. And so that allowed them to manually launch, so they didn't have to do it on the tablet anymore, but it automatically put the information in. They're able to select the protocols and what combinations of things from the front desk when they launched. And then they're bringing the information out as just PDF reports, which they could import into their EMR. And then this particular group actually expanded out to a satellite site with the same implementation. Then they partnered, and actually they were already using this behavioral health therapist before they even got around to doing their EMR integration, but finally they did the full EMR integration to get rid of the rest of the costs and so forth. And so they end up with two profit centers, one that's basically for the community mental health center around the behavioral health therapist, and then there's one from the clinic side in terms of screening. And it's a great model. It's a great way to get the support that you need and get the whole system running, and everything pays for itself. So making the business case is pretty easy to do. The only place where it gets a little dicey is, if you say you have capitated. But if you think about what you need to do for the capitated, the amount of cost and time that you spend on managing paper and the disadvantage of not having it electronically, you're still going to pay for it in terms of your overall operational costs, and then you just kind of absorb that administration cost into your operational costs. But it's still making you money, and you have to work your math a little bit more, but you can still show a positive ROI out of the situation. Anyway, that's just a quick go through on the money side of this thing. It's actually pretty straightforward. You can easily justify this from a business perspective. What we're going to do after that, now that we've kind of gone through the three world views of clinical, operational, and financial, now we're going to go over and say, okay, in webinar 4, let's talk about the nuts and bolts of implementing inside your clinic, and what's that really going to take, and what does that whole thing look like. So go ahead and scroll down. There's an area there for comments and so forth, and you should find links over to the final webinar there on what it's going to look like in your clinic. And you can also, I think there's links down there to go backwards and look at the other two if you want to go back and look at anything else there and so forth. Thank you for your time, and hopefully we'll see you on the next webinar. Thank you very much.